Hey, I'm Roland here at MWC 2018, and I found a device that is from Wiko. Wiko is a French company that belongs to Tino Mobile from China, and they're just launching the Wiko View2 and the Wiko View2 Pro. The devices look pretty much the same from the outside. The only difference is in the camera and in the CPU and the memory, but let's just have a quick look at the View2, and I'll show you the View2 in a second, the View2 Pro in a second. You might already have noticed up here, this is like pretty much the second or third phone out on the market that has a notch with a camera at the top, right in the middle. It's a pretty pronounced notch actually, because they have a pretty big camera module in there, it seems. This is a 16 megapixel front camera right here. This one has a 2.0 aperture. The Wiko View2 Pro has a 1.75 aperture. And they are supposed to be optically stabilized, but I don't know if it's actually hardware optical stabilization or it's just software. But let's just have a closer look. So as you can see, there's this camera module right here that has its own notch, and on the sides you could see that basically they're cutting the corners round and they're less rounded at the bottom. Also, the frame up here is a little less wide on the side than it is on the top, and the reason for that is pretty simple, because they're placing the speaker up here behind this little cutout up there. There's also your notification LED up here, and the whole thing is pretty interesting in this regard because they have a 19:9 aspect ratio on here. So the screen is actually an HD plus screen. It's an LCD running at 1528 by 720, which means it's basically 1440p or 1440 by 720 plus another 128 pixels for the notch or for the cutout up here. So this part from down here to the end up there is pretty much 128 pixels. So if you start this demo right here, they'll show you how they're planning to utilize that. Not only are they putting the status stuff up there, so battery, power, and Wi-Fi signal information, and also the time, but you can also, depending on the app, you'll have incoming calls displayed up here, media controls, like you just saw, and other stuff depending on the app. If it's not supported by the app itself, the scrolling and the screen will just start below that, like you just saw on the Twitter or messaging app that they had on the screen right there. Going down to the bottom, you'll end up with these on-screen buttons and the less rounded corners. And there's also a bit of a frame down here, so that's just about a bit more than 12 or maybe 11, 12 millimeters down here. No capacitive touch buttons, but on-screen buttons. And under the hood in the View2 is the Snapdragon 435. That's the octa-core SoC running 8 ARM Cortex A53 cores at 1.4 gigahertz. And the View2 Pro actually has a Snapdragon 450 under their hood, which is the 1.8 gigahertz SoC from Qualcomm. Both of them have X9 LTE modems in there, so they'll have 150 megabits downstream. The Wiko View2 has 3 gigs of RAM and 32 gigs of flash storage, and the Wiko View2 Pro has actually 4 gigs of RAM and 64 gigs of flash storage. Both are probably available with dual SIM plus SD card slots, and overall it's a pretty interesting package because you get this kind of weird form factor, but they're trying to really utilize that notch up here, and they're putting it into this sandwich of glass with a metal frame, so you get the this golden, in this case, aluminum frame. Up here is your SD card and SIM card slot. At the bottom there's actually a micro USB port, so no USB Type-C, although they have this space age notch at the top. There's 2 grills down here. One of them is probably just a speaker and the other one is only a mic. And moving over to the top of the device, you'll have your 3.5mm headset jack. And on the back is where it's also getting pretty interesting, because you have this glass cover on here. In the middle is the Fingerprint Reader. Under there is a 3000 milliamp hour battery. Up top on the rear of the Wiko View2 is this iPhone style or iPhone X style looking camera setup with a dual LED flash plus your 13 megapixel camera basically. Let's just quickly move over here to the right where you have the power button and the volume rocker. They are not the most sturdily built devices, at least talking about the buttons up here, because they're a bit wobbly actually. Pricing will probably be around 300, 350 euros, but that's only my personal guess because Wiko hasn't really said anything about this device yet. Also, this one is, as I said, the View2, but if I move over here and get you the View2 Pro, which pretty much looks the same from the front, but has, again, the Snapdragon SoC of a Snapdragon 450 under the hood. But if you move over to the back, you'll actually end up with this dual camera setup. So you have a, I think it's also 2.0 aperture camera setup back here, but those are two 16 megapixel cameras, and one of them is actually a wide angle lens. So you finally get some decent wide angle shots with a pretty high resolution, not like, for example, LG did with their 5 megapixel wide angle sensor. Under that is also the dual LED flash again, otherwise they're pretty much the same. So this one has 4 gigs of RAM and 64 gigs of flash storage, while the View 2 only has 332. And again, fingerprint reader back here. And let's just quickly go into the camera. Let me just try and move back here. Let's go into the camera, switch this thing over to the front. And as soon as you've moved to the back, you can hit this button back here and it'll switch between the two cameras. So this is a 60 megapixel image captured by the second wide angle camera. It's actually a 120-degree angle back here. And if you hit the button again, it just switches back to the main sensor that is the other 16 megapixel camera. So overall, these are two pretty interesting devices, especially in the regard of using this, the notch up here. Right now it's not fully optimized because if you start this demo app, it's actually running in a smaller size and not really fitting to the screen. But if you hit the button up here, it scales up and then it'll show you again how the notch is going to be used. That was the media controls. There's your call controls. It's probably all going to depend on the app and how they're using it, or if the developer actually supports the notch setup with the 128 extra pixels up there. Again, this is a 6-inch screen running at 1528 by 720 pixels. So this has just been a very quick look at the Wiko View2 and the Wiko View2 Pro here at MWC. I was Roland. If you like what I do, follow me on Twitter or just sub to the channel here on YouTube.